Yellow star means a quick check question is being covered. Okay, so this lesson is a lot of, I think, review, but we are building on some things. One of the first things that gets reviewed is Darwin's ideas, plural. So far, we've only learned about natural selection, but he also had a really other important idea that we haven't talked about yet, but we'll get there in just a minute. So let's review natural selection. So if you hopefully remember, hopefully this is all review, but for natural selection to work, and natural selection is a mechanism of how evolution occurs, how organisms change through time. But for it to work, there needs to first be a struggle for existence. So not all organisms get to survive and reproduce, but there has to be some sort of struggle. There has to be differences in the population. So not all organisms look exactly the same, have the exact same characteristics. There's got to be something different about them. And then that difference gives them variable fitness. So a variable ability to survive and reproduce. And that difference needs to be hereditary, meaning that they can pass it on. With that, if you have something that gives a variable fitness, that gives them an advantage, that's called competitive advantage, or an adaptation is another way to say it, but we've been using competitive advantage. So if there's something that gives them a competitive advantage, that variation that they have gives them a higher fitness, they have a competitive advantage, they have a better ability to survive, reproduce, and pass on that good trait, and then it becomes more common. Now, there is an interesting example of natural selection working right now in populations of African elephants in Africa. You probably may know, but African elephants are often poached, or all elephants are often poached for their ivory, for their tusks. So poached means illegally slaughtered, illegally killed. So people will go in and kill an elephant to take their tusks and then sell those on the black market. They're worth a lot of money, unfortunately. Well, there is variation within the African elephant population where some females don't develop tusks just naturally, just genetic variation. It wasn't a very common thing, but in areas where they have an increase in poaching, the females who don't develop tusks have a competitive advantage because no one's going to kill them for their tusks because they don't have them. So then they get to survive and then they reproduce and they can pass on that trait. So there have been studies that have shown that in populations of these elephants where there's a high amount of poaching, for whatever reason, you see an increased number of females without tusks, which I think is very interesting. So natural selection is often coined survival of the fittest, where fittest is the fitness and fitness is the ability to survive and reproduce. So those organisms that are most fit, that have that competitive advantage, get to survive and reproduce and pass on those traits. That was supposed to cover reproduce. It looks different in this program. But one type of increase in fitness is actually the ability to reproduce a lot. And we see that with like insects, bunnies. There are some organisms out there that reproduce a ton. And the idea is that the more that they reproduce, the more offspring they have, that increases their chance of those offspring having babies and further passing on the traits. So sometimes your, increased fitness can just be the ability to make a lot of babies. Because if you have a lot of babies, then again, some of them have, probability-wise are going to be able to survive, reproduce, and continue to pass on genes. All right, so Darwin's other idea that we haven't talked about is called descent with modification. All right, so descent with modification. So descent are like the offspring; those are the descendants, right? But with modification, so with changes, with differences. So descent with modification means that each generation is slightly different than the previous. So like with the African elephants that I was just talking about, we're seeing that there's an increase in females without tusks. So there's a slight difference than the previous generation. And in Darwin's mind, this is how evolution occurs. This was Darwin's evolution definition of evolution. And descent with modification can lead to speciation through, thousands of years. So in this picture I have up here, it shows the evolution of a horse, and we have fossils of these different horse ancestors. So here's our common day horse, and if you go back in time, this is what a horse looked like. Now this was 50 million years ago. 50 million years ago. So this is a long, long process. It takes a long, long time to lead to speciation, where you have so many things that are different and changed, but it has happened. Now, the idea of descent with modification and leading to speciation also encompasses the idea of a common ancestor. And that's one big idea with evolution, that if you go back in time far enough with any organism, you can find a common ancestor. And sometimes it's called the last common ancestor. And this picture here is trying to show the last common ancestor between all organisms on this planet. And it's true. Like, you could go back far enough in time and you could find the organism, the living thing, that eventually, through billions of years, was able to speciate into all the different things you see now. So, we've got bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Remember, these are our different domains. So again, if you go back far enough in time, you'd have the last common ancestor, but that doesn't mean it was the first thing that was ever alive. There's probably other things that have gone extinct. All these things are single-celled organisms before the origin of life, which is estimated to have began 4.4 billion years ago, I believe. The planets have been around for 4.5 billion. I found this picture that I just love. So it shows all the different organisms. And again, with the idea of common ancestor, you can go back far, take any two organisms and go back far enough in time and find a common ancestor between them. Or you can go back far enough to find a common ancestor between everything. All right, the other thing that this lesson covers and reviews is the idea that competition drives natural selection. So competition is because of that struggle for existence, because there isn't enough resources, there are not enough mates, there's not enough habitat and food, so you have to compete for it. And that can drive natural selection to choose the one with the best traits. So with this picture of the deer, so the one with the bigger antlers, it could be the one that wins. Possibly it could be the bigger antlers, maybe it's stronger in other ways. But anyhow, it can pass on those good traits, and in time, you might have bigger antlers for all your deers. With that, you can talk about competitive exclusion and resource partitioning. So with this idea that competition drives natural selection. So competitive exclusion is the principle that two species with identical niches cannot coexist indefinitely. So two species that like the same habitat and the same food sources cannot be in the same place at the same time. Eventually one will outcompete the other. So this idea, this competitive exclusion principle, is what leads to resource partitioning, which we have talked about. And resource partitioning is when similar species use the resource in a different way, or maybe a different place of the resource, or a different time. So I've shown this picture. You see this with a lot of bird species that are similar to each other. Their niches do overlap, but they compete in a way where you tend to find each species in a certain region of the habitat. So that's an example of resource partitioning. Another example is birds and bats. They eat the same thing. They can, they're both in the air. They're very similar, but they use those resources at different times of day. So they're no longer competing with each other. So that is another example of resource partitioning. The code word for this video is elephant. The code word for this video is elephant. All right, so if the organisms cannot resource partition, if they can't, like, one have an advantage in a slightly different way, and that never happens, then one species is going to outcompete the other and eliminate it from the environment. So your lesson talks about the paramecium studies that have been done, and paramecium are single-celled aquatic organisms. And there's lots of different species of paramecium, but these two are very similar to each other. They can grow separately very well, reach a carrying capacity, so that the blue line shows them growing separately. And then the purple line shows them growing together. And you can see that the P. aurelius, it reaches its carrying capacity. It's a little lower than when it grows separately, but it reaches there and stays pretty stable. Whereas the P, we'll call them PC, its population starts to decrease through time and eventually will get eliminated because it can't compete. It can't get the food sources as well as the other similar species. The same sort of thing is happening with squirrels in England. So in England, the native squirrel is a red squirrel, but the gray squirrel from North America has been introduced. So it's an invasive species and it's out competing this red squirrel. And in certain areas, it has eliminated them from the environment. And it's not just, so they do outcompete them, but there's been some other things that have happened. There was one type of food source like hazelnut or something that the red squirrel ate, but the gray squirrel wasn't eating. But then when that went away, it really caused problems for the red squirrel.